Welcome, listener, in the shadows. We bring stories into the light. Join me as we explore the encounters no one speaks of and the things that watch from the dark. Before we dive into tonight's terrifying tale, a quick question. Do you dare wear the fear? Our exclusive Shadows merch is here. Hoodies, tees, and more, designed for those who embrace the darkness. Get yours before they vanish forever. Link below. The Devil at Deadwood Creek Day 1. The start of the trail, the plan had been simple. A weekend hiking trip. Justily, his best friend Mark, and a few others from college, Jess, Tyler, and Becca. They wanted to get away from the noise of campus, spend a few days disconnected from the world, and breathe in some fresh autumn air. It was supposed to be fun, supposed to be normal. Deadwood Creek Trail was a lesser-known route, nestled deep in the Appalachian foothills. Jess had suggested it, claiming her uncle used to take her there as a kid. It's beautiful this time of year, she'd said. The trees turn this crazy shade of red, like the whole forest is on fire. It was beautiful. At first. They arrived in the early afternoon, backpacks stuffed with supplies, spirits high. The weather was crisp but clear, the trees just starting to shift into their autumn hues. The hike itself was long, about 10 miles to their planned campsite near the creek, but they had plenty of daylight left. As they walked, conversation flowed easily. Mark cracked jokes, Tyler played music from a small speaker strapped to his pack, and Becca snapped pictures of the scenery with her Polaroid camera. The trees rustled in the breeze, the distant murmur of the creek weaving through the silence between their voices. But then, about 5 miles in, the forest started to change. The first thing they noticed was the quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of their footsteps crunching through fallen leaves. The deeper they went, the heavier the air seemed to get. The trees grew taller, their trunks twisted and gnarled like ancient fingers reaching toward the sky. "This place gives me the creeps," Mark muttered, adjusting the straps of his pack. Jess rolled her eyes. "It's just the woods." "Relax." But he felt it too, an odd sensation like being watched. He shook it off. Just paranoia. Just the isolation playing tricks on them. They reached their campsite just before dusk. The creek was as picturesque as Jess had promised, its waters dark and slow-moving beneath the arching branches. They set up their tents, gathered wood for a fire, and cooked dinner over the open flames. By the time night fell, the unease had mostly faded, replaced by laughter and the flickering glow of the fire. Becca told ghost stories, Tyler passed around a flask of whiskey, and for a little while it felt like a normal camping trip. Then the laughter stopped. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the reach of their firelight, something moved. A rustling in the underbrush, slow and deliberate. They all froze, listening. "Probably just a deer," Jess whispered, though her voice wavered. Illy wasn't so sure. The sound wasn't erratic like an animal moving through the woods. It was steady, measured like footsteps. "Let's just get some sleep," Mark suggested, tossing another log onto the fire. "We've got a long hike tomorrow." Reluctantly, they agreed, retreating to their tents. The forest loomed around them, silent and still. Illy lay awake for hours, listening, waiting, but whatever had been out there was gone. Or at least, it wasn't making any noise anymore. Night won the first sign. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows against the dense tree line. The air was thick with pine and damp earth, the crisp night breeze rustling the canopy above. Illy leaned back against a fallen log, sipping from a flask while the others huddled around the warmth of the flames, swapping stories and laughter. It was the kind of night that made the wilderness feel alive, but not in a threatening way. At least, not yet. Matt was the first to notice. He stopped mid-sentence, his brow furrowing. "Did you hear that?" The group fell silent. The usual hum of nocturnal life had vanished. No crickets, no distant hoots of an owl, nothing. Just the whispering wind and the steady crackle of the fire. Probably just the woods settling. Lucas muttered, poking at the embers with a stick, but his voice was strained, like he was trying to convince himself more than the others. Then it came again, a sound just beyond the reach of their fire's glow. Faint, almost rhythmic. A low clicking, like nails tapping against bark. Illy turned toward the noise, peering into the darkness. Could be an animal, he offered, though his gut twisted. Something about it felt wrong. Sarah shivered and pulled her jacket tighter around her. Maybe we should call it a night. They reluctantly agreed, retreating to their tents, though none of them truly slept. The sound came again, closer this time. Matt swore he heard footsteps circling the camp, slow and deliberate. Illy, half awake, could have sworn he saw a shadow shift against the firelight, something tall just standing beyond the tree line, watching. But when he blinked, it was gone. By morning, the sound was forgotten, dismissed as the paranoia of an unfamiliar place. Day 2, the forest knows the morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine as Illy unzipped his tent. The sun hadn't fully crested the horizon yet, but a pale light filtered through the trees, casting long, trembling shadows across the forest floor. The fire pit from last night was nothing but a smoldering ring of embers. The logs collapsed into blackened husks. His friends were beginning to stir, groggy and sluggish from the weight of sleep. Matt was already stretching outside his tent, his breath visible in the cold morning air. Sarah and Lucas were slower to rise, cocooned in their sleeping bags. The only one missing was Tyler. "Where's Ty?" Illy asked, stepping into the middle of their makeshift camp. Matt frowned, rubbing his arms. "I thought he was in his tent." Illy walked over and unzipped it, revealing nothing but a flattened sleeping bag and an open pack. His boots were gone. The others had gathered by now, eyes still heavy with sleep but laced with growing concern. "Maybe he went to take a piss," Sarah suggested, though her voice wavered slightly. "Without his jacket," Lucas countered, pointing toward the spot where Tyler had left it hanging over a branch, "and his flashlight still here." A knot formed in Illy's stomach. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the forest. It was too early, too cold for someone to wander off, especially without saying anything. "Tyler," Illy's voice cut through the trees, swallowed almost instantly by the stillness. No response, only the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Sarah was already pulling on her boots. "We need to go find him." They split up into pairs, Illy with Matt, Sarah with Lucas, and fanned out, calling Tyler's name as they moved deeper into the woods. The morning light struggled to pierce the thick canopy, casting the undergrowth in a dim, uneasy twilight. Every snapped twig, every distant bird call made Illy's nerves bristle. Then, after nearly half an hour of searching, Matt grabbed his arm. Look, a single boot, Tyler's, half buried in the mud near the base of an old tree. The laces were undone, the leather scuffed as if he had been running. Next to it, faint but unmistakable, were deep impressions in the dirt. Footprints, but not human, something with claws. Illy's blood ran cold. "We need to get back to camp. Now." They turned and ran, the trees blurring past in streaks of green and brown. Every shadow, every twisted branch felt like it was reaching for them. By the time they burst into camp, Sarah and Lucas were already there, pale and breathless. "We found something," Lucas gasped, hands on his knees. Further up the creek, a sinking feeling settled in Illy's gut. "What?" Sarah swallowed hard. Tracks, huge ones, leading away from the water. The forest was watching them. Illy could feel it. They were no longer just lost hikers. They were being hunted. Day 3, something watches no one slept. They tried, huddled in their tents, gripping their knives and flashlights like lifelines, but every snapped branch, every distant rustle in the trees set their nerves on edge. Tyler was still missing, and now, in the cruel light of morning, the true weight of it settled over them. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to go now." Matt nodded, already stuffing his gear into his pack. Lucas, however, hesitated. What if Tyler's still out there? Illy looked toward the tree line. The tracks they had found, the ones leading away from the creek, were not human. Whatever made them had claws, and the sheer size of them suggested something impassable, something monstrous. "We'll follow the tracks," Illy said finally, tightening the straps on his pack, "just to see where they lead. If there's nothing, we head back to the car." The others didn't argue. They followed the tracks in a tight group, weapons drawn, Matt with his hunting knife, Lucas gripping a hatchet he had brought for chopping firewood. The footprints wove through the undergrowth in erratic, looping patterns, as if whatever left them had been pacing, circling, studying. Then the trees opened up into a clearing, and there at the center was Tyler's backpack. It was torn, shredded as if by massive claws. The contents were strewn about, his flashlight snapped in half, his extra clothes soaked in mud. And next to it, carved deep into the bark of a tree, were symbols. jagged, crude symbols that looked like they had been made with claws. Then, from the darkness of the trees, a voice called out, a cry for help. It was Tyler's voice, but something was off. Just slightly wrong, as if whatever was out there tried to mimic Tyler's last words. The sound of Tyler's voice, warped, just a breath away from human, froze them in place. It came from deeper within the trees, carrying through the mist with an unnatural clarity, like it was being whispered directly into their ears. "Help me!" Illy's breath caught in his throat. The voice wavered, thick with desperation, but something about it twisted his insides. It was too precise, too rehearsed, a puppet imitating a man. Matt gripped his knife tighter. "That's not Tyler." Lucas turned, eyes darting between the trees. "How do you know?" "Because it's coming from everywhere," Sarah whispered. And she was right. The voice no longer came from one direction. It circled them, moving unnaturally fast, shifting between the trees with a sound like rustling leaves. Each time it spoke, the tone changed, subtly distorted, as if it was learning how to mimic better. "Please, I don't know where I am." A branch snapped. Then another. Something was moving through the undergrowth, large and heavy, yet eerily smooth in its movements. The trees shivered as if recoiling from whatever prowled beneath them. Illy swallowed hard, fighting the instinct to run. "We need to move. Now." They backed away from the clearing, keeping their eyes locked on the shifting shadows between the trees. The weight of unseen eyes pressed down on them, suffocating like a dozen figures lurking just beyond the edge of sight. Then it spoke again, closer this time. Illy's stomach dropped. The way it said his name, slow, deliberate, savoring the syllables, made his skin crawl. Then something stepped into the clearing. At first, it was only a silhouette, tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally elongated. The dim morning light struggled to define it, as if its very presence was rejecting form, resisting reality itself. But then it tilted its head, and the semblance of a face emerged. The skin was stretched too tight over jagged, protruding bones, its color an unnatural shade of ashen gray. Hollowed cheeks pulled back into a lipless grimace, exposing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, were nothing more than sunken pits of darkness, swallowing the light instead of reflecting it. Antlers, gnarled and twisted like the roots of a dead tree, protruded from its skull, draped in strips of decayed flesh and tufts of matted fur. The creature stood motionless, its breath a raspy, rattling wheeze that echoed through the trees. Then, with an unsettling grace, it took a step forward. Its legs were too long, joints bending in ways that defied nature. The ground crunched beneath its hooved feet, though no leaves or twigs lay in its path. Illy, it spoke again, but this time the voice did not belong to Tyler. It was deeper, layered, like a chorus of voices overlapping, all crying out in anguish. Some were familiar, some were not. Illy's breath hitched. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The others stood frozen in place, horror-stricken. Then the thing moved, not with a step, not with a lunge, but with a blur of motion, too fast for something so large. It was suddenly closer, just feet away. The air turned frigid, breath curling in the cold as the scent of decay and rot filled their lungs. Lucas was the first to break. With a strangled cry, he turned and bolted into the trees. "Lucas, no," Sarah started, but he was already gone, crashing blindly through the underbrush. The creature watched him go. And then, as if amused, it let out a slow, shuddering exhale before turning its attention back to Illy. The corners of its mouth curled upward in a grotesque imitation of a smile. Illy's body finally obeyed. He ran. He didn't look back. Couldn't. The forest around them twisted, the trees warping and stretching as if the very land rejected their presence. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, and the air pulsed with a sound just beneath hearing, a hungry, whispering static. Matt and Sarah were just behind him, their ragged breaths and pounding footsteps proof that they were still alive. But Lucas was gone. And deep within the woods, his scream was cut short. The forest fell silent once more. They didn't stop running. Not until their legs gave out, not until their lungs burned, not until their bodies collapsed into the cold, damp earth. They had to find the way out. Before the thing decided it was still hungry, Illy gasped for air, his vision swimming as he pressed a trembling hand against the nearest tree to steady himself. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, drowning out everything except the ragged breaths of Sarah and Matt beside him. The forest felt wrong, stretched and unfamiliar, as though they had run into a place that wasn't meant to be found. The trees loomed taller, their bark blackened and gnarled, twisted into grotesque shapes that resembled clawed hands reaching for the sky. And the silence, it was worse than before. Sarah clutched Ellie's arm, her fingers ice cold. "Lucas." "I know," Ellie whispered, his voice hollow. "I know." Somewhere behind them, buried deep in the trees, Lucas had screamed. And then, just like that, he was gone. No struggle, no rustling of branches, nothing. Just silence, as if the forest itself had swallowed him whole. Matt doubled over, hands on his knees, sucking in gulps of air. We have to go back." Illy wanted to agree, but the image of that thing standing in the clearing, wearing Tyler's stolen voice, was burned into his mind. It had let Lucas run, not because it was slow, not because it couldn't catch him, because it wanted him to run. Illy shuddered. "No," he said finally, shaking his head. "We can't go back." Matt snapped his head up, his face twisted with fury. "We're just gonna leave him." Sarah's voice cracked. "You saw what it did. You heard. We don't know what it did." Matt's voice rose, too loud. It carried through the trees like an invitation, a desperate challenge thrown into the void. "For all we know, he's still." A snapping branch cut him off. They all froze. The sound hadn't come from behind them. It had come from ahead. Ellie's breath hitched as his eyes darted between the trees. The air around them had shifted, the unnatural stillness pressing against them like a physical weight. The shadows between the trunks deepened, stretching in unnatural ways, shifting when nothing moved. Then they heard it, a single shuddering breath, not from one throat but from many. Ellie's skin prickled with cold terror. His hand found Sarah's, squeezing it tight. Matt's fingers curled around the hatchet at his belt. And then the voice came again, a garbled, choked mockery of Lucas's voice. "Gee, guys." It was close, too close. Matt stiffened. "Lucas." Illy grabbed his wrist before he could move. "That's not him." The thing in the darkness exhaled again, deep and rattling, the sound of lungs long rotted but still breathing. Then it spoke again. "Help me." A horrible, wet cracking noise echoed through the trees, followed by a dragging sound. Sarah whimpered, her nails digging into Ellie's arm. He wanted to run, wanted to move, but his body was locked in place, paralyzed by the primal fear that told him if he moved, if he breathed too loudly, the thing would come for them next. The dragging stopped, and then a long, clawed hand reached into the moonlight. It wasn't Lucas's hand. The skin was stretched too thin over protruding bones, the fingers impassably long, ending in jagged, blackened claws. The flesh at the wrist was torn, peeled back like something had worn it as an afterthought, exposing raw, glistening sinew beneath. The hand flexed once. Then the thing stepped forward, and it had Lucas's face, or what used to be Lucas's face. The skin barely clung to the skull beneath, warped into a grotesque mask, the eyes sunken and glassy. The jaw hung too loose, unhinged as if something else was inside it, wearing him like a disguise that didn't quite fit. Sarah let out a strangled sob. Matt took a step back, his hands shaking. The thing tilted its head, then it smiled. A sick parody of a human expression, stretching Lucas's stolen skin too wide over its unnatural maw. And then it lunged. Ellie barely had time to shove Sarah out of the way before the thing moved. 1 second, it was at the tree line. The next, it was right there. The stench of rot and death filled Ellie's nose as something cold and wrong brushed against his arm. He stumbled back, just in time to see Matt swing his hatchet. The blade bit into the thing's shoulder and stuck. A horrible, gurgling sound escaped the thing's throat. Then it turned its head slowly, unnaturally, until its empty eyes locked onto Matt's. It didn't even flinch. Matt yanked the hatchet free, stumbling backward, but it was too late. The thing moved again, faster than anything should, its bony fingers latching onto Matt's arm. "Illy," Matt's voice cracked with terror. The forest blurred around them, twisting and stretching in ways that made no sense. Time lost all meaning. Seconds, minutes, hours bled together in a frantic sprint through the endless trees. Sarah was ahead of him, her breath ragged, her steps stumbling. Matt, he didn't know. He had been there one moment screaming and then the next, gone. Just like Tyler, just like Lucas, something moved in the trees behind them. A shape barely glimpsed between the branches, always just out of sight. It didn't need to chase them. It was herding them. Sarah tripped. Ellie barely caught her before she hit the ground, dragging her back to her feet. "Come on," he gasped. "We're almost there." But he had no idea if that was true. And then a break in the trees. The road. The old, cracked pavement stretched out in front of them, bathed in the weak, early morning light. The sight of it nearly brought Ellie to his knees. The car was still there, covered in dew, a beacon of salvation in a nightmare that had almost swallowed them whole. Sarah sobbed as they sprinted for it. Ellie fumbled for the keys in his pocket, hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped them. He yanked open the door, shoved Sarah inside, and dove in after her, slamming the locks down. The forest remained still. No movement, no sound. Ellie's breath came in uneven gulps. He risked a glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing at the tree line. But there was nothing. Just the empty road and the endless trees. He turned the key. The engine roared to life. Sarah let out a broken sob, and that's when Ellie realized something. The forest had let them go, not because they had escaped, but because it wanted them to leave. Because now they knew. Now they would remember, and so would it. You made it back for now. But the things in the dark never truly leave, do they? They watch, they wait, and perhaps they remember you now, too. If you want to hear more, if you dare to listen again, step back into the shadows. Like the video. Subscribe, but know this, some doors once opened do not close so easily.